My name is Chris Williams with RTPay. Listening to the mood of the speakers, it sounds as though it's not going to get a lot better in terms of the amount of donors or the amount of money being offered. I think we understand that. There's a tightening of money, particularly in Europe. So I would ask a question. The way of actually getting money into the right hands would seem to me to encourage the remittances market to be more effective. We have a very large amount of money, much larger than the donations, that could be made better for remittances because they're not very effective at the moment. Going to some countries, I mean, Somalia you mentioned, there is a way of getting money there, but it's extremely expensive. It's the only quote I could see of money going through is 16 to 18% out of it. Now that's a lot of money, where we have now technology, I think particularly of blockchain, where if that was operational through the central banks of the destination countries, you can bring down the price to below the 3% SDG target. I would love to see the IMF take that stage forward to actually work with central banks to see how they could do that.
Okay, great, thanks. Great question, thank you. Others here and then over on the side.
Thanks. I'm James Dean. I'm with BBC Media Action, which is a charity of a BBC working mostly in fragile states. Can the panelists talk a bit more about actually what we mean by inclusive politics and where that debate has actually got to? An awful lot of the conversation is on building the capacity of a state, but has the debate on inclusive politics actually shifted and improved? Are we making real progress there? How important is it that we do? I saw in the LSE IGC report that elections is perhaps something that should be less of a focus and the political settlement more of a focus, but at the same time it talks an awful lot about focusing strongly on issues of shared identity in the context of fragmented societies. So have we got the balance right between the societal and the state? Just some reflections on that would be very helpful.
Great question, thanks. Dirk.
Dirk de Velde from the Overseas Development Institute. I'd like to come back to Marcus's point, and I'd like that nameplate to come here, in the sense that we want that road to be built, isn't it? And I think because we listened to David Caru's point around the importance of infrastructure and helping countries to transform their economies, and that the donor community need to be working with institutions, with the government to actually help countries transform and build infrastructure. And I think that's got to be answered, that question. How do you do that? And I think what we're learning, and we've just also put out something from the Supporting Economic Transformation Program, that it's really important that, to be working politically, working with institutions, and it's a labor-intensive process. So you need to have people on the ground working with government. And so one of the things that I would say is that it's really important to get more people from the IMF in the countries. And can't we solve that coordination failure here? That basically says, David said from the Sierra Leone perspective, we'd like more people to work with us on economic development. The gentleman from the IMF basically criticizes the IMF for not having enough people on the ground. The DFID chief economist is saying we're willing to think more on people on the ground. This is just a coordination failure we can solve, can't we? We have now something from a developing country. There's a donor perspective and there's an IMF perspective. We can actually break that through. It needs leadership to actually just break that through and support countries where they want support.
Great. So 3 complex issues, remittances, much has been said and written. Very curious to hear what the panelists think. Inclusive politics, I mean, for my money, these are all political problems. If you're not dealing with that, you might as well go home. And the coordination failures, and particularly getting complex things done like, and expensive things done like building roads. who wants to jump in on any of these topics? I'll call on you if you don't
Roads
volunteer.
and inclusive growth, inclusive politics. So I was actually here shortly after I arrived as chief economist at ODI on a conversation about mainly about inclusive politics, actually, and I was talking about elections, and Yuan was talking about how you got inclusive politics in China in a kind of non-elections, and other people on the panel too. But I think my take on that, to summarise, that whole hour and a half session we had on that, is you have to start from where the country is. And different countries have very different problems. So I slightly worry, that one of the things I wasn't so keen on in the Fragility Commission report is sort of the assumption that all conflict is ethnically based, which it wasn't in Sierra Leone, for example, and that therefore you shouldn't rush to elections. Well, there is then the question of when do you move to elections and when do you bring other voices in? So as I say, I think it's all about understanding the situation on the ground and how do you get voice in that context, and how do you push that along in a way that is not going to make the fragility worse. Can I just do a rant on roads? Having done an impact evaluation of roads in Sierra Leone, and everyone's, a lot of people talk about it, and
electricity's fine as well.
yeah, but it's really different in countries that have low population density. So the cost per, which I assume is the case in South Sudan, where you're saying, you said, well, people looked at it and said it wasn't cost effective. Well,
no, they said it was too costly. It was too costly.
Yeah,
That was the problem.
okay. But we really have to think about our models differently in countries where the people are very sparsely populated, because the cost per mile of road is really high, and often there's like 5 people per mile, and so it may or may not be worth doing. And in our evaluation of roads in Sierra Leone, they kind of got washed away after 2 years. So just.
Okay, good warning. Yep. Say something about remittances, whatever else you want to say,
Yeah.
Charles.
I'll say something about remittances. I mean, this is a technical issue. I'm not an expert. Certainly, there's massive potential to use new technologies, blockchain, digital currencies. Many potential options are being developed that could vastly reduce the transactions costs, which should be hugely beneficial. There is a countervailing concern, though, that if you open up these channels without scrutiny, then they can also be used for other less positive purposes, like counter-terrorist financing or money laundering purposes. So there is that trade-off there, which means while it's a massive opportunity, you also need to make sure you don't open up the channels for nefarious purposes. On coordination on the ground, I think that's really important. I think the IMF in general does not fully appreciate the value of coordination with the donor community. In our report, we try to encourage the fund to be more open. Coordination is not just about the fund telling others what they think, but also listening to others and participating in a two-way dialogue. The fund business model does not put a lot of boots on the ground. In some countries, there are no boots on the ground. There are like 5 countries, no boots at all. But even in countries where fund staff is allowed to go, the fund will typically have maybe one resident representative and maybe 1 or 2 resident advisors, and that's paltry compared to what DFID or the World Bank would put on the ground, and it's expensive. So it's partly a matter of resources, and I think the fund does need to go out and get more resources, perhaps build up a fragile state trust fund to finance more on-the-ground support for capacity development. So I think money is important, but the fund needs to recognize that you need to coordinate as a fundamental contribution to public good.
Any other very quick responses? I want to go out one more round to the audience before we run out of time.
I need to make a comment.
Please.
Yeah, but I want to take each topic, the remittance, inclusive politics, and the impact of road development in the country. Now, for the remittances, the way I see it work is that people in the diaspora having families in the country would remit, say, $100 every month to upkeep the family. Now, that empowers the family to be able to pay for certain things themselves, like health, at times education, and it reduces the pressure on government to fund those things or to pursue things like free education, because now the people are empowered to deal with these things themselves. So remittance is very important, and we must create a way to make sure that it happens painlessly. I note your concern about terrorist funding, etc., but there are now international structures built to deal with that, and it will come under compliance. Now, I'll give you one quick example. The government now, the present government now, is thinking that the way it can fund education, free education in Sierra Leone going forward, is to make sure that the people in the diaspora fund that. How are they going to do it? If you want to vote in 5 years' time, you must demonstrate that you have paid some taxes towards the system. And if they charge you $200 per annum as your own contribution for tax, and you get a certificate to say that you have paid some taxes, then in 5 years' time, the infrastructure for voting would include some web-based voting system that you would participate. Now, if we take $200 for 500,000 people, we have a lot more than 500,000 people in the diaspora, but that's about $100 million per annum. You run that for 5 years. It may not solve all the education problem, but it goes a long way. Now, inclusive politics. Now, at times our politics fail because people have needs, people have views, but their views are not heard. And that was one of the things that caused Sierra Leone to get into war some 15, 20 years ago. Now, we must find a way to listen to them, and we must have their views incorporated in the national growth agenda. The last point I want to make is the impact on roads. Because of poor connectivity between cities and towns, out of a population of 7 million people in Sierra Leone, we've got 6 million people in Freetown. So the infrastructure for Freetown, the roads, the water, the electricity, they've all collapsed because they cannot support that kind of population. Also in 2010, 2009, when I was in the Ministry of Trade, I was trying to understand why we were importing so much food into the country. And I engaged with the farmers. The farms are in far-flung places, and people can grow food, but they cannot get it to the market. Creating roads, some form of roads, would just open up the whole economy. So the impact of the road is not just being measured by some mathematical internal rate of returns. There's a social return as well. You know, you can open up the country, you can get people to earn more, you can connect them from the farm to the market, etc. And it would contribute in its own way to the growth of the country. That's what we are talking about.
Thank you. I hope we're going to have an IRR on roads Twitter battle after this ends, because I'm sure there's a lot out there on it.
A quick word on inclusive policies. I have to. You know, the New Deal's first peace building and state building goal is inclusive politics, or as it was known then, legitimate politics. So what is it? It is still a very contested issue which we have not sufficiently addressed. However, over the last 10 years, we have become an international dialogue which also contains an important civil society network of organizations in country. What we're increasingly trying to do is catalyze sustained conversations between the different constituencies of the dialogue donors, government, and civil society in country. There are already structures that exist for that. In some places, we're trying to see how to re-inject or revive energy into those structures. It includes inclusion, when, how much, of who, are questions that can only be resolved locally, and listening to what's happening locally is critical to get a sense of this. And even then, it's still a very challenging area. And I don't think that the international community or the donor community, at least within the dialogue, has a consistent view on it. I think it's inclusive politics, but we're not all necessarily talking about the same things at the same time.
Can I go back out, or do you have? All right, so anybody with a burning question, we only have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to come back to the panelists for a speed round of 1 minute each. Does anybody have a burning question? Gentleman in the back. Anybody else? Go ahead. Yeah,
okay.
please.
You talked a lot about political risk. One of the things that I've been finding is that the heart of political risk is trust, and at the heart of trust are relationships. And Marcus, earlier you were talking about having a framework to try and monitor and understand impact. And perhaps if we look at relationships and the impact that whether the donors are having on relationships within government, or the way governments are having impact on relationships within their own countries, within their own communities, between government, central government and local government, and looking at through this relationship lens, you have a framework there to try and understand, for example, roads, how roads can improve relationships between different communities, and that can help improve cost effectiveness, for example. So my point is, I think we should look through a relationship lens, and looking at relationships is a good way to understand the impact that we're having on fragility.
Thanks. And gentleman in the back for the final question.
So, framing the issue around fragile states as a global security issue is certainly an effective way to acquire funding, especially from government donors, but I'm wondering how much is it actually hampering effective work to achieve sustainable change in fragile states?
Interesting. So questions on narrative relationships. I'm going to go down the line here. You each have about 1 minute. And I'm going to throw one thing on top of it, which is that when we're sitting here together in 7 years' time, what is the thing that you would fear most we are not going to have fixed that we've all focused on today, which to my mind means what's the thing that we really need to be putting on the top of the agenda right now? Catherine.
Oh gosh, I have to think while I'm speaking. Okay, let me say the thing I wanted to say. We have a wonderful blog entitled "Dialogue is the X Factor of Trust Building in Somalia," and it's written by Adil Garane, who's in the Ministry of Finance and was part of this group. And he's basically saying that the ability of donors and governments to continue to talk to each other about this thing made the big difference, and it's a plea for that continuing. When you started asking your last question, I thought you were going to say, what is the single most thing we really need to do? And I was going to wave this around and say it's called How to Scale Up Responsible Investment in Fragile Environments. And basically, the dialogue of many years ago, of 3 years ago, wanted to develop a new deal for the private sector, i.e. how to engage private actors in this discussion. And from that, we had a wonderful collaborative piece of work with BNP Paribas Asset Management, the sustainable bit of that, to talk about how to get institutional investors interested in a new narrative around risk. We learned a lot, that there is energy in this space. Okay, so I'm coming to what might not happen. What's been difficult within a dialogue that is essentially led or populated by people in either not so much in the Ministry of Finance in G7+, but conflict advisors who work on peace and so on, is the difficulty of engaging with this kind of agenda. And so I wonder, unless a platform like the dialogue opens itself up to other actors, private and IMF colleagues here, we'll still be talking and writing nice documents, but we don't actually have enabled others to come in, and you start to perhaps think of how to use ODA differently to leverage that kind of investment. So
That's great. Good problem to crack. Charles?
I think the key risk is whether we can develop the commitment to actually moving forward with the solutions that I think all of us on the panel broadly agree on. Whether the fund, for example, will continue to be balancing this against that, or whether it will say, okay, this is an international priority, we need to help these countries. This is one of the ways in which the fund can truly help to contribute to the global public good. Therefore, we will take these actions. We will worry a little bit less about the side effects and unintended consequences, and just go direct to be committed to making a difference in these countries.
Great. David?
Yeah. Okay. What would I want to see in the next 7 years? Now, in parallel with managing fragility, with all the wonderful recommendations in the report, I would like to see a framework for supporting the private sector, which would perhaps include political risk insurance, how to make it easy for them to access it, concessional loans, credit guarantee schemes. There are things that would give assurance to people investing in difficult countries that they can, well, they should be able to get some of their money back if the country goes belly up, which we all hope that it would not.
That's great.
So I just want to say we kind of got a bit depressed in this panel about that we're not making any progress, and I think that is maybe a bit extreme. So there will still be fragile states with us in 7 years. I mean, that's just, there will be poverty, there will be fragility. So that's not the right bar to set ourselves. We need to be taking this seriously. We need to be trying to build these, innovative arrangements that are country, that make sense in the local country. And I think we have had some examples in the last few years of the donor community trying to do that. Somalia we've talked about, but also if you look at the arrangements in Jordan to try and say, well, let's come into Jordan in a way that is quite different from the way the donor community has worked before, given that they have suddenly had this massive increase in refugees, and that's putting pressure on the local domestic system. So we're not going to only give money to refugees, we're going to think about what's the impact of that on the rest of the state. So yes, we've got a lot to work to do. I think the IMF is one of the places where we have, but let's not get too depressed about that we haven't learned anything in the last few years about how to do this work.
Marcus?
I think we may be missing public anger. I think we need to have the same mindset as we suddenly got onto debt. We all knew debt was a real problem, but until we actually worked out what we were going to do about it, and in particular in which countries we were prepared to do something different and change the rules, that we were going to do it for these HIPIC countries, I think we're not going to get motion. And until, the Minister of Finance of Germany isn't being lobbied by people over debt, stroke the IMF involvement in fragile states, we're not going to see some of this change. Because I agree there are some things making progress, but I think we could do a lot better. And I think we'd do a lot better if we were all more honest about what we need to change within ourselves to do that. I don't see that happening without some sort of public anger about, I don't want to see so many children dying in Yemen, I don't want to see so many children dying in South Sudan, I don't want to see Ebola coming again in DRC. This is, get your act together, stop, messing around and break down the constraints on your institutions that you need to in order to change this. And I think if we could get that happening, then I think we might see something really different in 7 years.
Well, I think that the roots of optimism are not only that there have been some remarkable successes. I mean, you can look back at Sierra Leone, Liberia, Colombia, Bosnia, other places that we all remember all too recently were in the midst of conflict and have made great progress. But it doesn't undermine the fact that the challenges are enormous. The optimism that I take away is that every single one of you believes that progress is possible. So even if we're not always doing the best, we all believe that collectively the institutions that we've been talking about and the countries that we've been talking about actually have the potential for positive momentum in the next couple of years. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific conversation.